Hey everyone, and welcome back to part 2 of the Magic Jar watercolors. In the first part, I worked only with watercolor, and now I'll continue with the entire top row, tackling the larger background and exploring and using watercolor's transparency. I received a lot of questions after the last video, so in this part, I'll answer some of them. Let's start with one of the biggest concerns, what the page looks like when you turn it over. I'll show you that right away. Keep in mind that because the background is mostly blank and I'm filming with my phone, the paper might look quite wrinkled, but this gives me a great opportunity to talk about watercolor in adult coloring books. Books are not made for watercolor, and that's completely normal. Most colorists use pencils, markers, or other dry media. Coloring books are often highly detailed, and watercolor is a demanding medium that requires special paper to absorb the paint properly. But for those of us who love working with a brush, it's still possible to enjoy watercolor in coloring books. You just need to be open to experimenting and managing the quirks of the paper. If you're working with watercolor, expect some buckling, especially if only part of the page is painted. The colors won't behave the same way as they would on 100% cotton paper, and that's okay. The more you work with these materials, the more comfortable you'll become with their unique effects. The good news is that there are ways to minimize beginner mistakes. I'll explain some tips and techniques throughout this video to help you get smoother results and feel more confident with watercoloring coloring books. I'll start with a small drawing of leaves to fill in the background a bit, keeping the same style we started with, just 2 or 3 leaves over the jar. Right away, I'll cover the black lines with gesso so they don't interfere with my painting. Since I want the jars to stay transparent, I'll also take care of the background right away. If you're hesitant about doing a watercolor background, you can use light, bright watercolor pencils and work section by section. I'll use a large brush to fill in the background quickly, but if you have only a small brush, that's fine too. Just keep in mind that smaller brushes leave more visible strokes, so it's best to work gradually and thin out the edges with water for a smoother effect. Be patient, unlike me, since I have to go a bit bolder here. I already know roughly how my paper will behave. It will wrinkle a little because I'm covering a large area, but that's expected. If you work in smaller sections, the paper tends to wrinkle less, but I want a smooth, seamless background without too many visible brush lines, so I'll paint the entire top section in one go. This will also be a great opportunity to show you how the page looks on the other side after layering watercolor. Don't forget to place a sheet of paper underneath so the paint doesn't seep through to the other parts of the book. I'm working directly on dry paper. If you're a beginner, start with a light layer of watercolor and let it dry completely before adding more. I rushed a bit here, but you'll have much better control if you let each layer dry before continuing. I'll keep the area around the second jar light, as I plan to darken only the corners of the page, so we need less pigment here. It's always best to start with light layers and gradually build up the darker areas, since lightening watercolor is nearly impossible. Even acrylic paint struggles with that. If you're still unsure, you can combine watercolor pencils with watercolor for the darker areas. Just be patient, dry each layer in between, and blend the edges with clean water as smoothly as possible. You might notice small dots appearing on the wet paper. That's completely normal. This happens with paper that doesn't absorb water well, but most of it will fade as it dries. Not completely, and that's okay too. Watercoloring books isn't about perfection, so it's best to accept that from the start. Sometimes small imperfections seem worse before you start building up the picture. You have to trust the process, watch how the watercolor behaves, be curious about how it changes as it dries. Once it's dry, we might be able to play with the shapes that appear or simply layer over them. Since this is a different kind of paper, we just need to be a little more patient, that's all. When working on filling in the larger parts, you'll need to work a bit faster, which is why a slightly bigger brush is helpful. Try not to go over the same area too much, lay down the color, darken if needed, soften the edges with water, and move on. Keep an eye on how the paint dries overall. If you spot an unwanted line, fix it quickly and keep going. But that doesn't mean you need to panic. Find a pace that allows you to work calmly and with control. If something goes wrong, just pause, let it dry, and adjust. If you're doing this for the first time, it might feel a bit intimidating. We all want to keep our pages and books looking beautiful, and even I still get a little nervous, especially when filming, since I have to focus on multiple things at once. Mistakes happen, but the more you practice, the more you'll realize that trusting the process is key. And even in a coloring book, there's always a way to fix things if something doesn't go as planned. This is how the page looks when it dries. It might not look very pretty at this stage, but once we fill it in, it will straighten out a bit. This is just how watercolor behaves, especially since I used a lot of water. If you work on the background slowly, piece by piece, like I did on this other page, you'll notice less warping. So the more patient you are and the less water you use, the better the page will hold its shape. Also, if you combine watercolor with other mediums like colored pencils, the page will gradually flatten out over time. However, for now, I'm intentionally sticking to watercolor only. I'll admit I used more water than I usually do on this page because of the open, empty background, but that's all part of experimenting. Let's go with warm colors for this vanity table, just like we used in the first jar. I'll be using warm browns, but you can also add a bit of warm gray around the edges to create a white effect, or even soft yellows, so whatever suits your style. Since these are small details, don't worry about getting everything perfect. When painting rounded parts like table legs or frame, try to keep the center lighter and the edges darker to create depth, rather than coating everything evenly. While the paint is still wet, you can also add a touch of darker pigment here and there to blend it naturally. For these details, a very thin brush will make things easier. I still often use cheap synthetic brushes for coloring books and replace them as needed, and I'm still searching for the perfect detail brushes. Most importantly, use whatever you have and don't let imperfections hold you back. If your goal is to improve, the key is to experiment, practice, and enjoy the process. I'll add some red details here and there on the table to break up the monotony of the brown tones inside the jar. If red isn't your preference, you can use a lighter color instead, like light turquoise, pale green, white, or bright yellow to create some contrast. For the copper metal lid, I'll use warm and rich colors. The key to achieving a metallic shine is strategic highlights, leaving enough white areas at the start and carefully layering darker tones in the right places. If you're unsure how to place the highlights, you might find it helpful to look up a reference image on Google to study how light interacts with the copper lid. For now, I'll experiment with colors and see what works best. And don't worry, if you accidentally cover too much of the lighter area, you can always touch it up with a bit of gesso or acrylic paint. For the mirror and around the table, I will use a slightly hazy look, since Johanna put a few lines here to insinuate that mist inside the jar, so it's a very simple idea to fill this part. I want very transparent jars though, and first I will make it look like there is a little grass sticking out of the back of the jar. It is easier to do such things with light watercolor first because the mist will cover all the flaws and excess that is visible. Mist is very difficult to get with watercolor alone on this kind of paper, so gesso will come in handy here. I will slightly cover these lines that Johanna drew and create little clouds by dabbing the brush accordingly. You can also use a slightly fluffy brush, a small sponge, or just try to make misty shapes with your finger. I will also cover the edges of the jar with a thin brush. This does not look very good for now, but when it dries, we will go over it with watercolor. I'm often asked if I can use gouache or colored acrylic instead of these things, and of course, always whatever you have, maybe you'll get something better than this, why not? Now I will create a soft mist effect by applying watercolor in circular motions over the gesso. I don't need much pigment for this step, but I do feel that the lower part needs a bit more depth, so I will add a darker tone to help create the illusion of rounded glass as it fades toward the top. The best approach here is to start with light colors and gradually build up the effect layer by layer, darkening certain areas as needed. Since I don't have a reference for this part, I'm experimenting with light strokes to see how it turns out. This is the part I'm not entirely happy with, but it can be adjusted later using a white or light blue pencil to refine the mist effect. For the ground, you'll need a slightly bigger brush to cover the area more quickly. Again, use more pigment than water. You shouldn't use too much water anyway. However, if you work fast enough, you can simply fill in the lower part with light brown and then add darker brown under the jar while it's still slightly wet. This will create a nice blended effect for the shadow. We'll make this third glass a bit lighter, similar to the first one, especially since it will be surrounded by a darker background. Maintaining the right balance between dark and light colors is key to making the overall composition look harmonious. Again, I'll start with light colors, diluting the pigment with enough water and gradually building up layers. Then, using a slightly darker tone, we'll start defining the shapes by working from the edges inward, making sure to leave enough highlights to create a glowing effect. When painting these small details in the third jar, I'll use the same colors as in the first two. If you have elements like fruits in purple or other colors that haven't been used before, it's just best to stick with similar shades that already appear in the painting. Otherwise, they might draw attention to an unimportant spot and disrupt the flow of the composition. In a detailed piece like this, you want the viewer's eye to move naturally across the artwork rather than getting stuck on a distracting color. Keeping the palette harmonious ensures a balanced and visually pleasing result. I get asked how long it takes me to paint a page, but I never actually measure it. I paint because I enjoy it, and time becomes irrelevant. Interestingly, I usually get this question when I use watercolors, but not when I color with pencils, which I find a bit unusual. Since many people are curious about watercolor as a medium, I'd like to show the real-time painting process, excluding drying time and things like changing water or setting up supplies. Watercolor is generally a fast medium, especially when it comes to shading and color mixing, which are much easier compared to layering with pencils. The only thing that might take longer is waiting for layers to dry, which requires patience. There's also no need for extensive blending, which is something I admire in colored pencils but personally find uneasy. Achieving that smooth, polished look with pencils takes a lot of time and careful work. As you can see here, filling in smaller areas goes quickly, and when you're painting, you tend to lose track of time. Drying happens naturally as you move on to other things, making the whole process quite relaxing. Unlike with pencils, watercolor allows for more fluidity and doesn't demand as much precision or perfection, which is one of the things I love about it. Now I'm taking a break from painting inside the jar to let the bottom dry a bit before moving on to the fruit sack. Next, I'll use a slightly thicker brush, about size 6, to fill in the background. I just need to continue the same style as the first corner, starting with the ground. Make sure to have clean water ready, and starting with a lighter layer, then gradually add a darker one, quickly rinsing your brush in between to prevent the colors from bleeding too much. Once you finish a section, soften the edges so the color fades smoothly. Be careful not to use too much water. If you do, simply dab it with a tissue to remove the excess. Work a little faster here, and you don't have to hesitate to add a second layer of darker paint for the shadow under the jar just a bit. It will allow it to spread naturally. Just use a bit more pigment in that case. Don't worry if something doesn't look perfect. This is just the first layer and you can adjust things as soon as it dries. Just be mindful not to go too dark too soon. You can also try adding a bit of grass here and there. Once you have a few dried shapes in place, you'll start seeing more possibilities and the process will feel much easier moving forward. When painting branches, or in this case a tree, start on dry paper, but don't use too much pigment right away. The first layer should have some transparency to let the turquoise base show through, and a slight blur will help create the illusion of distance behind the jars. As you move toward the corner, the tree should get darker. If you're unsure at first, simply suggest the shape with a light layer, let it dry, and then gradually build up more layers. Remember, if some parts don't turn out exactly as you'd like, you can always refine them later with pencils. Take your time and approach it with curiosity. Watch how the shape naturally forms rather than trying to create a perfect tree right away. When painting small fruits piled together, focus on keeping the highlights and defining their shapes rather than adding too many details. Start by placing the dark shadows where needed to show that, for example, one apple is on top of another while leaving small white areas for highlights. Next, rinse your brush and use a lighter color to quickly fill in the rest. Once it dries, you can always add another layer for more depth and definition. If the highlights fade too much, you can easily bring them back with a dot of gesso or white acrylic paint. The second layer on the background is all about refining shapes and adding finishing details. We'll build up some softer layers and add a few leaves to enhance the composition. The upper section will frame the jars nicely, bringing balance to the piece. I'll add a few flying leaves, small and transparent, to create the effect of them floating around. This will help fill in the background effortlessly, as well as little stones and grass around the jars. A touch of sparkles will enhance the magical atmosphere, and with that, the upper part will be complete. I could go on and on adding little things, but always try to ask yourself if this further addition of little things will help you make the page look better, or are you already overworking? You can certainly leave adding details until the entire page is completely finished. Since we now have a situation here where half of the paper is filled with watercolor and the other half is empty, you can see that the paper is wrinkled a little at the edges, mostly at the transition between the wet and dry part, because the fibers spread unevenly. The wet side stretches while the dry side remains the same. I want to point out that this is the UK version of the Rooms of Wonder coloring book. From experience, I know that at least a few years ago there were small differences between editions, and it seemed to me that the paper in the US version was slightly thicker and wrinkled less. However, I can't confirm if that applies to all editions. Still, I want you to be aware that there might be differences. That being said, I personally haven't had any issues with Johanna Basford's coloring books. I'm testing and applying water here without any problems. If your experience is different, it might be useful to check reviews and comments about the differences in paper quality. You could also see that I really applied a lot of water and watercolor to fill this background. Normally for this type of page with a larger background, I would use watercolor pencils because with them you can more easily control the background and go piece by piece. In that case, the paper would wrinkle less, but here I did everything in watercolor on purpose. When you use more pencils and go smaller sections at a time, there is less wrinkling and the paper will also straighten out some parts a little once the entire paper is colored. I have to mention that the paper looks slightly better in person than on camera due to the light, but I just don't mind that coloring phase. These are all things you simply have to be prepared for when using watercoloring books because paper is not adequate for this type of medium, but also watercolors give us a wonderful transparency, softness, and airy effects. You can cover a larger part of the picture faster. The colors can be easily covered with pencils or other media if you messed up a part, and it also gives beautiful effects when mixing colors that are harder to achieve with some other techniques. So it's up to you to actually determine what is more important to you when coloring and the final look. I definitely plan to finish this page. I already have some kind of plan on how to finish this part and connect the background to make it like one connected picture. There will definitely be some trial and error, but that's part of the process and I'm excited to see how it all comes together. Thank you for watching. You can find all the details about the materials in the video description, and if you enjoyed the video, feel free to like or share. It helps me keep making tutorials. No pressure, just glad to have you here. Until next time.